they're not slow, they're not stupid, they're not lazy. Far from it. In fact, isn't that the case with a lot of these people?
Absolutely. In fact, it's quite well documented now that many people with dyslexia have huge strengths and talents. For example, over the last 100, 150 years, most of the major breakthroughs that have happened in terms of technology and science have actually been from people who are dyslexic. I can't remember the exact figure, but I know it was something around the region of about 60% of entrepreneurs tend to be dyslexic. You can look at lots of famous people like Richard Branson, Jamie Oliver, many actors, Tom Cruise, Daniel Radcliffe. They actually all come out with dyslexia.
It certainly hasn't held Richard Branson back anyway.
Absolutely not. And in fact, they think now he has ADHD as well because he's able to focus on so many things at the same time.
Yeah.
So rather than looking at the kind of in quotation marks, the deficits, what it is they can't do, what we do at Empowering Learning Ireland is actually look at what are their strengths and talents, what is it they can do that they're really interested in, that actually comes quite easily to them and maybe to other people would be very, very difficult because their brain is just simply not working the same way. So we come in through that door.
And what about in schools? Because, there's teachers in schools, and this is a totally different, this is a completely different training, I would imagine, as well. So how do teachers who are, let's say, teaching a primary school class and they've maybe 2 dyslexic students, how do they deal with that? And then not single somebody out, because they don't need to be singled out and make feel different, but how does a teacher do this? Is there separate training that's kind of been offered to these people?
My company is actually the only one at the moment that's offering this training, but I am joining forces with Frobel Teacher Training College that's now part of NUI Maynooth, and I've got 16 staff from 16 schools across the country who have actually done this training. And in particular, actually, junior infants and senior infants is really key because we want to kind of catch those students as they start to struggle. And over the last 15 years or so, the majority of literacy programs have been taught through what's called phonics, then synthetic phonics. So it's segmenting and blending. It's kind of breaking down, the individual sounds and then putting them back together to form the word. And that works for the large majority of students. It actually works really, really well. And there's lots of great resources and packages and training around that. But for those people with dyslexia, there's a term that's been coined, which is phonological deficit. And what it essentially shows is that if you actually look at MRI scans, fMRI scans of people with dyslexia when they're reading, is that the phonological part of their brain is actually not lighting up. In fact, neither is the visual part of their brain. What is lighting up is they're trying to pronounce it all the time rather than recognise it and make meaning out of what they're reading. But however, as I said, quite often most people with dyslexia are very, very highly talented, actually particularly in their visual spatial part of their brain. So it's their mental imagery, and this is kind of the key word key term that we use, which is what are you seeing inside your mind's eye? And most people who are really good at spelling will unconsciously be using their mind's eye to see a whole word. So when as long as they've seen it and they know what it means and they can, they know how to pronounce it, then when they think of the word, it'll just come into their mind and they can see it and they can write it down. Or they just know, they're kind of left with the knowing. If someone's struggling to spell, it's because they're not actually seeing that word inside their mind. So even if you use sounds, if you think about the English language, how crazy it is, we have words that are spelt differently, have completely different meanings, but sound exactly the same. So you have, like wood and wood. We'd like to go to the wood. There is 3 different spellings. They're over there collecting their coats.
Yeah.
We
don't make it easy for ourselves.
We definitely don't make it easy for ourselves. We have lots of different origins of the English language, and they all have different rules. So what we have to know is we have to see the word in its entirety and to know what it means. And so that's how we work. We do something called global learning rather than linear learning. So rather than having little bits of information that build up to big bits of information, so sounds building up to bigger sounds, building up to full words, is we actually work on the 3 parts of the brain that co-activate when we read anyway, which is the meaning of the word, visually recognising the word, and knowing how to pronounce it. And we actually teach that as a little package of information each time. And we start with what are called concrete nouns. So the meaning, the pronunciation is already there. So like cat or dog or bus.
Yeah.
Things that are very, very, that are already stored inside the mind's eye. And a lot of neuroscientific research has actually shown that what we do is, in fact, inside our brains is we have a visual dictionary. So once we've learnt a word, it actually goes into the visual part of the brain so that when we see it, we recognise it. People who are very good readers, who are very fluent, are actually not reading in the sense that they're breaking down and, the sounds and putting them back together again. They see the whole word, they recognise it, they're not even reading it in quotation marks in the sense that they just see it and it automatically lights up that part of the brain.
Because I was saying to you just before we went on air there that's the one part in school that's so hard for people, whether they're dyslexic or not as well, is being asked to read in class. I mean, so a lot of teachers don't even think that that's an issue, and they think that you're kind of a troublemaker if you don't want to do it. But it's a lot of pressure to put on anybody in general.
It's a huge amount of pressure, and as I said to you as well just before we went on air, the reading out loud is 2 things. You're reading and you're performing. And one of the other parts of our program is very much about the role that stress plays in terms of learning. And people have definitely found that when they're tired, if they have a diagnosis of dyslexic, they'll often find that when they're tired, when they're very stressed, when they're very worried about something, their symptoms actually worsen.
Okay.
So, but in fact, it's the same for everybody. I know from my own experience. I used to be an engineer, actually. That was my original background many, many years ago. And then I went into coaching and how the brain works and, helping people to unravel their strategies internally and put them back together more effectively. So I have a kind of engineering brain. I like problems. And but I remember turning over my first A-level physics paper, and I was so worried and I was so worked up that when I looked at it, I went, interesting. They're doing it in Greek this year because it didn't make... And I kept thinking, I know this answer. And the harder I tried to remember it, of course, the further away the information was, going into my mind, like trying to remember a dream. And I remember being so confused at that time, thinking, what on earth happened to me? I knew that subject.
Yeah.
And so I wasn't someone who struggled to learn. But if that could happen to me, imagine someone who's already struggling to learn and to use their memory effectively, and then they go into a stressed state. That's just not going to happen. And
you kind of shut down then.
Absolutely.
You won't
and
get
it's because
anything.
the body thinks you're under attack.
Yeah.
If you're stressed, you think you're in danger. So you want to be focusing on what's going on around you rather than internally what you know. So that's a big part of what we do. We actually teach a very simple technique for getting into a really effective learning state.
We have a text in, actually, a phone call. Caroline rang in to say that her son, age 9, had 3 sessions with Sarah. It was fantastic. Excellent results. I mean, what's involved in it? Is it different for every person that you have depending on their needs?
It is pretty bespoke, but we do follow a sort of a protocol as well, which is that number one is to check people's mental imagery. And you might think, well, how do you do that? Well, it's actually just through questions. Even as people are listening here, if I just said a word, it's to notice what's everyone will be thinking about it in a different way. So if I just said the word giraffe, everyone who hears that word will form a picture inside their mind, or will see the word, or will do something. I remember asking a very highly talented graphic designer, I said, when I say the word giraffe, what do you think of? And he said, the entire Serengeti. He says, it's not just a giraffe, there's zebras and there's wildebeest and there's trees and there's rivers. He said, I think about everything, but I only said one word.
Yeah.
So when you
I was literally in Dublin Zoo on a patch of grass looking at one giraffe when you said that.
Well, there you go. Some people might think of a cartoon giraffe or a cuddly toy, or multiple giraffes. There could be 100 giraffes. But it's quite interesting. Quite often when we're talking, and particularly teachers, when they're at the front of the class and they're saying something, there's kind of an expectation that everybody's going to be interpreting that the same way. We know at an unconscious level everyone's different, but until you start asking people questions, you actually don't realise how differently people are thinking and what's going on inside their minds. So one of the things we do is help people to control their mental imagery. If there's too much going on, if it's all moving around inside their mind, it's all maybe running at high speed, or there are multiple screens or multiple objects, then we actually help people, again through the stress reduction technique, to actually control their mental imagery. Once you can do that, then you can start adding in words.
Okay.
So we start with pictures and we just look at it, and then we teach, it's a process called grounding. It's very, very simple. It takes 30 seconds to a minute to do once you know how to do it. I have a whole school actually in St. Joseph's Primary School in Rathwire, Westmeath, has been doing this for 3 years. And every single class, every single morning, they all get grounded, the teachers, the students, they get grounded when there's a change.
I think we could do that in here, Sarah, in the morning, to be honest.
I know, it just feels very calm in here. So that's a good atmosphere.
What are sort of, for any parents who are listening at the moment who may have just that worry or concern that maybe their child who's young is possibly dyslexic, is there any telltale signs, or even apart from that, is there somewhere they could go directly to find out?
Yeah, they can... One of the problems is that kind of official assessments that are done for dyslexia, unfortunately at primary school, don't get the school any extra hours or funding. So you might kind of go, well, at least I know what's wrong with my child in terms of if they're having displaying certain symptoms. So it's things like very, very poor spelling. So they might spell correctly phonetically, but it's not the correct spelling. You might see lots of letter reversals. So B's and D's in particular, or P and Q.
They're kind of telltale signs.
Yeah, lots of crossing out in terms of their writing. Very, very reluctant readers, even if it's just one-to-one, they might kind of really struggle. Quite kind of monotone. So when they're reading, it's like they're reading the words, but they're not making any meaning out of it.
There's no intonation on anything.
No intonation. It's just the words. It's not. What is the information behind that? And whilst the diagnosis might kind of go, at least I know what's wrong. Quite often, actually, what is then actually done is pretty much similar techniques that are used already in class. And from my point of view, if it hasn't worked by senior infants or first class, it's really not going to work, because most people have already got the phonics and have started to transfer it into the visual part of their brain. People with dyslexia have just not got it, and they're not doing that. So, my website has quite a lot of information. It's empoweringlearning.ie. And there's you can have a look in terms of certain symptoms, in terms of just, again, it's not necessarily that they're dyslexic. It's quite interesting. You might have somebody who's very poor across the whole board in terms of their learning, and that might be other issues at play. But somebody with dyslexia tends to be very, very talented and creative in another area. So they might be brilliant at maths, or they might be great at science, or they might be fantastic sports people or artists. In fact, a lot of artists actually have dyslexia because their visual part of their brain is so highly developed.
It makes sense when you think about it. And even any people that I know that suffer as well, and they are actually artists. So it is one of those things. So I suppose where you feel in some ways that you've lost out on something, you've gained something else, so you haven't, Absolutely. So we focus on the strengths and talents, and we go in through that door. We use the visual part of the brain rather than trying to use the part that's struggling. So I sort of have the analogy of it's like somebody who's left-handed and you're trying to make them right-handedly. You probably could do it with a lot of effort, energy, and but the end result is they'll probably never have handwriting that's as good as if they just use their left hand. Exactly.
And you might traumatise them.
I suppose it's one of those things, we all have strengths and weaknesses, so play to your strengths and do as best as you can.
Absolutely.
So Sarah Habibi, I could talk to you all day about this actually. It is fascinating, and I know there's a lot of people listening at the moment who has really struck a chord with them. So just your website again if they want to get in touch or get involved.
Yep, it's www.empoweringlearning.ie.
Empoweringlearning.ie. Sarah, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Mel.
I've never seen a diamond in the flesh.